Hey, we're doing stand-up comedy in Los Angeles, Dallas, Texas, Austin, Texas, Baltimore, Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. It was subtle, but Tulsi was indirectly asked about her speaking out on the U.S.-funded biolabs in Ukraine. Did you know this? Senator Bennet, this guy, the guy who's has an alcohol problem, and I have sympathy for him. But he shows up to.
I don't go drive, dude. Go out and drive, please.
Very carefully asked Tulsi about her stance on Russia's legitimate security concerns and how she is repeating Russia's justification for invading Ukraine, which includes their accusations of U.S.-funded bioweapons development in Ukraine. Accusations.
What are peaceful biolabs? Rogo was joking. You make mushrooms, peaceful biolabs, brand mushrooms. Organic psilocybin.
So this senator is consciously avoiding saying any buzzwords like biolab or bioweapons because the Democrats know that people like me are waiting for them to bring it up. They are being very careful about how they question her about this subject without bringing more attention to the secret they are already desperately trying to cover up. The secret is that the United States was running biolabs in Ukraine. And why do you think that Dr. Fauci's pardon goes back to 2014? Why do you think Hunter Biden's pardon goes back to 2014? That's because, and Joe Biden's family's pardons go back. Why do you think that is? Because in 2014, the CIA instigated a coup of the democratically elected government in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that's when Joe Biden had control of the country. And that's
like the one they did here.
And that's when they started doing the biolabby things in Ukraine. That's why. So let's watch this.
Are you aware that your comments about proxy wars and
every
time he talks,
legitimate security concerns,
Good.
to quote your own words, are in alignment with what the Russians have said to justify their invasion of Ukraine? Yes or
Senator,
no?
I don't pay attention to Russian propaganda. My goal is to speak the truth,
the answer is
regardless of whether you like it or not.
I'll take it. That's fine. You said you are used to speaking truth to power.
Whatever. I don't even want to talk to you anymore.
What are you doing mentioning things that make me look like an ass chimp? Why are you why are you mentioning those? This is a one-way street. I get to embarrass you. You don't get to embarrass me back.
No, if you excuse me, I have to go drive to pick up my kids from school.
Senator Michael Bennet yells at Tulsi Gabbard for stating that the Ukraine war could likely have been avoided had the Biden administration addressed Russia's legitimate security concerns. He calls it Russian propaganda. If that's true, then
wait. Is Russian propaganda the truth? How could that be?
Turns out.
How could their form of propaganda just be objective facts we know happened?
So he calls this Russian propaganda, saying that the Ukraine war could have been avoided. He calls that Russian propaganda. Aaron Matei said, well, if that's true, then the top NATO and Obama officials have spread Russian propaganda because the NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, said Putin went to war to prevent more NATO on his borders. That's what the head of NATO said. Charles Kupchen, senior Obama official, Russia has legitimate security concerns about NATO setting up shop on the other side of its 1,000-mile-plus border with Ukraine. NATO may be a defensive alliance, but it brings to bear aggregate military power that Moscow understandably does not want parked near its territory. So he's calling that Russian propaganda. So,
are you aware?
So I just here's Matt Orfalea put this together, and if you don't think that the Ukraine war was about NATO threatening to expand into Ukraine, watch this.
President Putin actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign.
That's the head of NATO.
To promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that.
So Putin said, all you got to do is sign this paper that said you won't advance NATO into Ukraine and I won't invade Ukraine. And he said, no, not going to sign. So they're saying, no, we're going to threaten to expand right up to your border. Nuclear missiles, the whole deal. So right there we know, but what's this?
So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders.
There it is. He went to, so that's the head of NATO telling you that Putin and Russia went to war to prevent NATO from being on his border. He just said it. That's the head of NATO. You want to hear how that got reported in the news in the United States? Watch this.
Flashback.
This is fundamentally not about NATO expansion.
It was never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
It's absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
And it has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
Yeah, he's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason.
This is not about NATO expansion. This is about the democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
We are protecting democracy right now.
Ukraine is banning political parties.
Because it's a democracy.
Ukraine restricts books and music.
It's about democracy.
Ukraine won't hold elections.
It's about democracy.
And it's not about NATO expansion.
This war in Ukraine is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
That's not about NATO.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO expansion.
It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement. In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
It's not about NATO encroaching.
It was not about NATO. NATO is just a fictitious, imaginary adversary for Mr. Putin and for Russia.
It was never about NATO.
That's not what it's been about. It's been about him trying to expand his sphere of influence.
Hang on, I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, Russia has wished for a sphere of influence over Ukraine, but if the West had not challenged Russian interests so directly, I think that there was a chance to avoid this war.
He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. We rejected that.
Hey, we're doing stand-up comedy in Los Angeles, Dallas, Texas, Austin, Texas, Baltimore, Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.